Oh hell YouTube, I'm back for a bit more of the book of Master Mo. The next section is called Condemning Offensive Warfare. And I'm going to skip to the second of the three sections with this name. Condemning Offensive Warfare 1 is once again a little bit short and simplistic. But there is one thing I want to cover from it before we get started. In Condemning Offensive Warfare 1, Mo compares sort of trivial crimes that can be committed, such as stealing fruit from an orchard, stealing animals, and then moving up to more serious personal crimes like murder and assault, and considers how no one would consider these actions to be to be righteous and just, and no one would consider the perpetrators to be ren, to be compassionate and humane. And then towards the end of the section, he goes on to say, well, why do we consider that rulers then will engage in wholesale slaughter of hundreds of people when they do these offensive wars? Why is this considered ye by the rulers, if not necessarily by the common folk? And then at the end, he, in 17.3, makes this point. Now suppose there is someone who, when he saw a little bit of black, called it black, but when he saw a lot of black, called it white. We would certainly take this person to be someone who did not know the difference between white and black. And then compares, obviously, the same with the idea of ye when perpetrating crimes. I love these sort of metaphors that the ancient philosophers use, not because it means that they're exactly right, and of course there is always nuance to be had in anything so simplistic, but it immediately gets to the point of where they are coming from. It immediately lays out essentially a thesis statement for their point of view, and you can then kind of take that on board and work with that in mind. Socrates does this all the time in the dialogues of Plato. And it always makes me smile when he asks some innocent question, and then the person he's speaking to says, well, I certainly would say that. And then he asks another innocent question, and they say, well, I certainly would not say that. And the turn of phrase is always hilarious, and yeah, that's what I just love about ancient philosophers. Of course, there is a lot more to be said and a lot more detail to be dealt with, but I do love the kind of the pin-pricking sort of nature of some of these more direct metaphors, and it always sort of brings a smile to my face. But let's move on with Condemning Offensive Warfare 2, Chapter 18. 18.1. Master Mo spoke, saying, in ancient times, kings, dukes, and great officers, in conducting government in their states, genuinely wished to be careful with regard to censure and praise, to be just in rewards and punishments, and not to fail in judicial and administrative matters. Therefore, rightly, offensive warfare was something they could not pursue. Nowadays, if troops are mobilized and they go forth in winter, there is a fear of cold. And if they go forth in summer, there is a fear of heat. So they cannot be sent forth in either winter or summer. If they go forth in spring, it disrupts the people's planting and sowing, and the cultivation of trees. And if they go forth in autumn, it disrupts the people's reaping and storing. Now, as there is no one season without disruption, the ordinary people who die from hunger and cold cannot be counted. And if you try to calculate how much of the equipment, bamboo arrows, flags and banners and tents and other things which an army sets out with, is lost or destroyed and doesn't return, this is also beyond computation. Moreover, the spears, lances, halberds, swords, and war chariots the army goes forth with, which are destroyed, broken, and lost, and don't return, also cannot be counted. Further, of the oxen and horses that are fat when they go forth, those that are lean when they return, or those that die and are lost and don't return, cannot be counted. And in addition, because the road is long and food supplies are cut off without means of relief, the ordinary people who die cannot be counted. And because the places where they dwell cannot be made peaceful, they don't eat and drink at proper times, satiety and starvation cannot be controlled, and the ordinary people who become sick and die on the roads cannot be counted. Either the soldiers who are lost will be very many, or the whole army will be lost. In both cases, the losses cannot be counted. then ghosts and spirits will lose those descendants who can carry out the sacrifices, which is another incalculable loss. Ghosts and spirits, not something that's been brought up so far in the core doctrines, but it's basically a sort of animistic and ancestor worship based idea, which we will come back to in a later chapter. But aside from that, just the idea that any offensive warfare, any warfare at all, but particularly sort of first strike offensive warfare, creates these losses in the state which are just simply uncalculable as far as Mo is concerned, and as we see, leads on to a greater loss to the state in the long term than the ruler can justify by starting the offensive war in the first place. 18.2. When the rulers of states start wars, they deprive the people of their livelihoods and strip them of benefits to a very great extent. Why do they do this? They say, we covet the fame of conquest and wish to reap the benefits. That is why we do it. Master Mo spoke, saying, if you determine what they gain from victory, it isn't something that can be of use. If you calculate what they gain, it isn't nearly as much as they lose. Now, if you could attack a city with an inner wall of 3 li and an outer wall of 7 li without using sharp weapons and without anyone being killed, there would be no problem. But this is not the case. The number of people killed will range from 10,000 at the most to 1,000 at the least before a city with an inner wall of 3 li and an outer wall of 7 li can be taken. Now, in a state of 10,000 chariots, there is a large amount of waste land that can be occupied and vast open spaces that can be opened up, all without conquest. It is, then, a case of too much land but not enough officers and people. Now, to send officers and men to their deaths and to add to the misfortunes of those above and below in order to attack an empty city is to cast away what there is not enough of to gain what there is already an excess of. To govern like this is contrary to the basic interests of the state. So Mo is laying out why he thinks offensive wars are always counterproductive. Just to point out the measurement, a li is around about 0.6 kilometers, I think. A city with an inner wall of 3 li and an outer wall of 7 li is just sort of referring to the general size of the city or city-state that is being tackled. And the aggressor is presumed to be a state which has a decent military might. And if they are such a state, in a state of 10,000 chariots, there is going to be a large amount of land which is not currently being worked. This is due to the sort of nature of civilization at that time. So any offensive warfare is always, by definition almost, going to be throwing away the precious resource of the state, that is its population, in order to gain a relatively needless resource, which is extra land. You know, one could claim that, by getting extra land, we are gaining extra resources. But if there is no population to work that land, what essentially are you really gaining? So in this sense, Mo is saying that starting an offensive war, and in the first strike sense, is never going to be energetically useful to any state that exists at that time. He will go on to defend certain types of war, wars of retribution, for example. However, this is specifically referring to any warfare which is started without initial sort of inciting incidents. These days, nowadays, as Mo would say, people will always try and fabricate an inciting incident. A great example, I imagine, would be the American wars in the Middle East, incited by the event of 9/11. Now, quite aside from the death toll on either side there, it is well known that the war in Iraq was absolutely unrelated to 9/11, and yet it was used as its justification. So I think, there is some complexity there, and I don't know what Mo would have to say about the fact that very often they will try and fabricate inciting incidents to claim that a war is not offensive when in fact it is. However, we can leave that aside and just take the general idea of offensive wars being bad. So, 18.3. Those who argue in favor of offensive warfare say, to the south there are the kings of Jing and Wu. To the north there are the princes of Qi and Jin. At the time of the world when these rulers were first established, the size of their lands did not reach several hundred li, and the number of their people did not reach several 100,000. By means of offensive warfare, their lands have been extended to several thousand li, and their people now number several millions. That this validates offensive warfare cannot be denied. Master Mo spoke, saying, although 4 or 5 states may have benefited by this means, I still say that this is not the right way. For example, a doctor treats those who are sick with medicines. Now suppose there was this doctor who so unified his treatment that he gave the same medicine to all the sick people of the world, and 10,000 people who took it, but only 4 or 5 got any benefit. We would say that this was not a good medicine. Therefore, a filial son would not give it to his parents, and a loyal minister would not give it to his ruler. So, at first glance, I think this is not a great metaphor, because it seems like, well, there must be fewer than 10,000 states. But actually, Mo will go on to talk about that, yes, there once were 10,000 states, and that they have been reduced only to 4 or 5 by the use of offensive warfare. In this sense, he's talking about the cultural destruction that is enforced by the destruction of other tribes. I think the 10,000 states he refers to would be better described as tribes. So, although I still don't think it's a great metaphor, this one of the doctor giving a medicine to 10,000 people and only 4 or 5 getting better, I think that Mo's perspective on it is a little bit more realistic. And either way, yes, you can say that, well, when a large state enriches itself through offensive warfare, you could say that that state benefits, but you certainly can also say that all the states that it destroys do not benefit. And who is to say that the offensive state is correct? In fact, if we follow the example from the first section, where, if a crime is not yi when perpetrated by a single person, then it is most certainly not yi when perpetrated by a state against a far greater number of people, then the state that makes use of offensive warfare is perhaps the least worthy state to ultimately benefit from the gains that they make. But overall, I don't think anecdotal evidence proves anybody's point here. I don't think that you can say that the medical analogy works well, but I don't think you can say that just because a few states have benefited by offensive warfare, that this therefore justifies offensive warfare either. So 18.4. In ancient times, states were established in the world. The number of these that were lost through offensive warfare cannot be counted. Those in the distant past we hear about, those more recently we see for ourselves. How do I know this is so? In the east there was Ju, which was a very small state, squeezed in between large states. It did not show due deference to the large states, and they in turn did not foster it or wish to benefit it. So from the east the people of Yue encroached upon it and seized territory, while from the west the people of Qi annexed it and incorporated it. If we think about why Ju was destroyed between Qi and Yue, it was due to offensive warfare. Even the destruction of Chen and Chai in the south, situated as they were between Wu and Yue, was also due to offensive warfare. So too was the destruction of Zhu, Bute between Yan, Dai, Hu and Mo in the north. Therefore, Master Mo said, the ancients had this saying, if you plan and are unsuccessful, then use the past to predict the future, and use the manifest to know the hidden. If you plan like this, you can succeed and know. I'm not quite sure what he's saying at the end. Actually, there is a quote attributed to Confucius: "Study the past if you would define the future." This seems to be very similar, and apparently it comes from the ancients. I guess that it is talking about how maybe the small states should react in response to the large states. It does make a point of saying that Jew did not show due deference to the larger states, and that they in turn did not foster it or wish to benefit it. So perhaps here we are seeing how offensive warfare leads to the destruction of smaller states and the destruction of their cultural traditions, where universal love, as we saw in the previous section, might lead to the fostering of smaller states and an enriching of the cultural tradition of the land as a whole. In the modern world, in the modern mass society, I believe that, the cultural traditions can be maintained while we all take our place in a larger holistic system, if something like the doctrine of universal love can be taken on board by the rulers of states, something which does not seem entirely likely at this point. 18.5. Basically, might makes right. The advocates of offensive warfare say, others may not be able to gather and utilize the great mass of their people for the purpose of destruction. We, however, are able to gather and utilize the great mass of our people and employ them in offensive warfare in the world. So who would dare not to submit to us? Master Mo spoke, saying, although you may be able to gather and utilize the great mass of your people, how can you compare with Helu of Wu in ancient times? He trained his troops for 7 years, so that wearing armor and carrying weapons, they could travel fast for 300 li before resting, about 200 kilometers. When stationed at Julin, they came forth onto the track at Mingai and engaged the Chu forces at Boju. Helu took control of Chu and forced Song and Lu to come to his court and offer tribute. When it came to Fuchai himself, he attacked Qi to the north, positioning his troops above Wen. He joined battle at Ailing and inflicted a crushing defeat on the people of Qi, forcing them to retreat to Mount Tai. To the east he attacked Yue, crossing 3 rivers and 5 lakes and compelling the Yue forces to take refuge at Guiji. None of the kingdoms of the 9 tribes, the eastern barbarians, did not submit. When he returned, he was unable to reward those bereaved or to bestow charity on the people. He took advantage of his own strength, boasted about his achievements, and flaunted his own brilliance, but neglected to train his troops. Subsequently, he built a tower at Gusu, which was still not complete after 7 years. By this time, there was disaffection and weariness in the hearts of the people of Wu. The king of Yue Gojian saw the dissension and discord between superiors and inferiors in Wu, so he assembled his forces to take revenge on his enemy. Entering through the outer wall to the north, he seized the great boat and surrounded the royal palace, and so the state of Wu was lost. So here we see an inevitable outcome of the lack of universal love. Helu of Wu was this great general who perpetrated this extremely successful campaign. And if we follow the advocates of offensive warfare, we would say, well, because he has this great might and this ability to marshal great forces, thus all will submit, and therefore the offensive war is justified. But Mo says we'll take a long-term view. When one perpetrates these offensive wars, you will necessarily, as we saw at the beginning, expend this great amount of resources. When you come back, you will be unable to attend to your people effectively, and in time, inevitably, there will be disaffection. Also, if one takes too great a pride in one's martial achievements, one can become complacent and boastful and start to build these great towers which are not complete simply because the scale was too great, or that the people were not motivated anymore because they did not care about these great victories that were achieved in other places. They care about the state of their lives right now. And here we see how rulers can become, despite maybe the best intentions, alienated from their citizens and unable to maintain their power. And for me, taking a Taoist view, this is, in my view, because yang begets yang energy in the state of rulership, perhaps. Yang is the controlling power, yin is the surrendering power. And if one makes the purpose of one's life to continue putting yang energy out into the world, one must find a justification for this. And ultimately that justification can become reinforcing of itself. Slight tangent here, but I once heard somebody talking about how they choose to invest in businesses. And they spoke of how a person they want to invest in, they must be, in some sense, treating themselves seriously. And that means, dressing up like a business person, having some kind of, pride in their own appearance. And if a person takes themselves seriously, then you can believe that they're going to take their business enterprise seriously. I do not fundamentally disagree with this. However, what I will say is this idea of taking oneself seriously is the idea of validating yang power. A business dress is a uniform. A uniform indicates that you are, overstating it, going to war. That is not to say that every person who puts on a business dress and tries to make a successful business enterprise is going to war with others. But on some level, they are. You are, whenever you start a new enterprise, seeking to control some part of the world. That is putting yang energy out into the world. And ultimately, when you control the world, you force others to become yin to your will. You force others to, in some sense, surrender. Now, putting it in those stark terms is very reductive. Of course, the creation of new forms requires the control of the world to some extent. The ability to be a leader and to be a ruler, even the most Ren and Yi ruler that can exist, requires the exertion of some control, and no one should deny that. What becomes a problem is when it becomes self-reinforcing, and this is my concern about many of the systems that we see in the modern world. The idea that yang power is self-reinforcing and that people who make use of it seek to essentially salve their conscience in the continued use of yang power by basically putting all concerns out of their mind. In a way, that's all that being successful is. When you exert the use of controlling power and you put aside any thoughts that you might be wrong. You have to put aside the idea that maybe your idea isn't such a great idea, or maybe the effects on the world aren't so fantastic. And the thing is, again, that is necessary. If you were constantly worrying about every little thing that might go wrong with your idea or that might not be ideal about your idea, you would never do anything at all. And that is absolutely true. On the other hand, that itself can become a habit that is unhealthy, where you are so used to putting aside any concerns that you start to put aside valid concerns. Anyway, that is a little bit of a side note, but a relevant one, I feel. Let's move on to 18.6. In former times, Jin had 6 generals, none of whom was as strong as Zhibo. Reckoning on the great extent of his lands and the large number of his people, he wished to oppose the feudal lords in order to glorify his name. Just to say, this is clearly a person who has ceased to have any concerns about his own sense of yi. This is a person who clearly now thinks that anything he does is right simply by virtue of the fact that it is he who does it. And that is the problem to which I was just alluding there. So he selected his bravest soldiers and organized all his boats and chariots in great numbers to attack Zhonggang and possess his lands. Thinking his plans were sufficient, he also attacked the Fan House and completely defeated it. Thus he combined the 3 houses into one. Still he did not stop, but surrounded Jiaoxiangji at Jinyang. When this happened, Han and Wei got together to plan, saying, "There is an old adage which says, when the lips are lost, the teeth become cold." Okay. If the house of Zhao is destroyed in the morning, we will follow it in the evening. If the Zhao family is killed in the evening, we will follow it in the morning. The ode says, if a fish cannot move swiftly in water, how will it manage on dry land? Therefore, the 3 rulers worked together with singleness of purpose, opening gates and clearing roads, donning armor and raising officers. So, with Han and Wei acting from without, and the Zhao house acting from within, they struck at Zhibo and completely defeated him. A similar example here to the last one, simply saying that the perpetrator of offensive wars, having become unbalanced in their intention, despite whatever their original purpose may have been, they now are focused purely on their own self-glorification. And ultimately, no matter how successful you are at first, others will see your offensive warfare as a threat to themselves, and should it become necessary, will band together so that ultimately you will be defeated. Thus, again, showing the futility of offensive warfare, quite aside from the negative consequences that you have upon your own people and the people of other states, the ordinary people who are in no way connected to the rulership of their states, ordinary people who are essentially the lifeblood of any state, not the land, not the territory, but the population that works the land. Those are the people whom you are essentially beholden to when you are the ruler of the state. And those are the people who the perpetrator of offensive warfare carelessly discards in their thoughts of glorification and endless victory. We might think of the example of Alexander the Great, who basically and unrepentantly became focused on simply endless domination and conquest. Clearly this was a pathological approach to expansion of territory, and I doubt he even considered how his state, how his empire would be run after his passing, and indeed it did not survive his passing for even a handful of years. Finishing off then, 18.7. This is why Master Mo spoke, saying, in ancient times there was the saying, the noble man doesn't seek his reflection in water, but in the people. From a reflection in water, he sees only his face. From a reflection in the people, he can know good fortune and bad fortune. Nowadays, if there are those who take offensive warfare to be beneficial, should they not examine this in the mirror of Zhibo's affairs? It can easily be recognized that this is not auspicious, but inauspicious. And that's a beautiful end, I think, to that. The noble man doesn't seek his reflection in water, but in the people. And how true that is nowadays, in Mo's time, and nowadays in our own time. We can see that when the people become dissatisfied with endless warfare, clearly what the ruler or rulers are doing can be seen to be not auspicious, but inauspicious. And again, not only for those that they attack, but ultimately in the long term for themselves. And I briefly mentioned it before, but we could come back to the example of America, which has spent so much time in recent years perpetrating wars and encouraging others to join them, and others entirely have been complicit in doing so, perpetrating these wars for their own glorification, or for the husbanding of resources which it is possible to take. The world, of course, is different in this day and age in that certain resources, notably oil, can be obtained and stockpiled and then used at a later time. This was not the case with the majority of resources that one could take in offensive warfares in Mo's time. In Mo's time, we were talking more about land, and what can you gain from land is the increasing of food and building materials and things like that. Some of these could be retained, some of these could be stockpiled, but ultimately they all needed a great space in which to keep them. They needed warehouses and palaces where they could be stored. Resources different in this day and age. Oil, I've already mentioned, but money even more so. So the acquisition of wealth might be seen as a justification for offensive wars. However, ultimately, you do not see your reflection in the mirror, but in your own population. And how the population reacts to the offensive wars is a far more telling indicator of what those wars truly represent than it is of anything that you gain by them in the material sense. And again, that's only if you specifically consider your own state. But if you are taking Mo's doctrine of universal love seriously, you should also be considering the people of other states and even the rulers of other states. I mean, you may have your disagreements with the rulers of other states. You may even have some justification for a war against another state. And Mo does not completely, outright deny the usefulness of warfare and the necessity of warfare. But the doctrine of universal love will always say that whenever you are considering your martial situation, it should always be in the context of viewing other people and the other states in the same way that you would view your own people and your own states. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So that is my perspective on Mo's perspective on condemning offensive warfare. Let me know what you think about this. Please comment below, especially if you're familiar with the Book of Mo and have some other opinion. But even if not, please tell me what you think, and please let me know down below. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye for now.